Well, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for being with us this morning, and thank you, John. We're so excited to welcome you to the third single candidate forum that the Children's Policy Coalition has done in this primary season. So welcome, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the issues facing Iowa's children and families. We know that children's health, education, safety, general well-being should be a top priority, and in order to ensure that all kids have what they need to thrive, the Children's Policy Coalition has invited all candidates in the gubernatorial race to meet with us and to talk about these urgent issues facing our kids and families. Just to tell you a little bit about the coalition, it's a group of 30 state-based organizations that are committed to raising the profile of kids' issues during both state and federal elections. And we won't endorse any candidates or score anyone in any way. We simply just want to get more information into the hands of voters so that they feel confident when they go to vote on June 5th and in November, that they have everything that they need to know to make the best decision, in their opinion, to who's going to be the best person to support kids and families. So we're really excited to have this conversation with you today. I just want to note, we want it to be comfortable and no one feel like it's super formal or anything. It can be a dialogue.
Well, no endorsement. I can't blow too bad then.
Yeah, no worries. So I'll start. I'll have everyone introduce themselves so you can get to know us, and then we'd love to hear a little bit from you and what your priorities are in your campaign. So I'm Jill Applegate. I am the program manager for Every Child Matters in Iowa, and I am the co-chair of the Children's Policy Coalition.
Lana Shope with Iowa Community Action Association and Iowa Head Start.
Abby Patterson with Prevent Child Abuse Iowa.
Denise Rathman, National Association of Social Workers, Iowa Chapter.
Angelica Cardenas, Child and Family Policy Center.
Charlie Bruner, Freelance Child Policy Agitator.
Steve Dykstra, CFPC.
Or Bremner, Polk County Early Childhood Iowa.
Dee Cook, United Ways of Iowa, which is the statewide association of all 25 United Ways.
Brittany Samuelson, Iowa After School Alliance.
Darren Madigan, Iowa Association for the Education of Young Children.
Sheila Hansen, Child and Family Policy Center, and I'm co-chair with Jill of the coalition.
And Marion L. Travis, Child and Family Policy Center.
So yeah, you have the floor.
My floor, you want to just tell you a little about my campaign?
Yeah.
I've been talking about. Well, I will say that I don't know at what point last fall I kind of, as you start one of these campaigns out, this wasn't on my bucket list, and I had and get my head around the issues, what they've done at the Capitol obviously has gotten all of us worried about Iowa's future. But I have led with breaking the cycle of poverty since last fall. Tonight, if you go to my Iowa Futures Forum at the DMAT campus, my first slide is on education, the second one's on income and poverty. It is what I've been talking about throughout the campaign. And a heavy focus on children, heavy focus on education, on all those contributing factors to the cycle of poverty. I lead most of my speeches with nearly half the babies in Iowa born eligible for Medicaid. Free and reduced lunch has doubled in the last 15 years, which presents a whole different set of challenges for our classroom teacher than when I grew up going to real public schools. When half of our children arrive either food insecure or from a single parent home who's working 60 hours a week to make it on our low wages, or a substance abuse home, a domestic violence home, that is a different set of challenges for a teacher. You layer upon that the fact that our English language learners have nearly tripled in the last 17 years. That's an additional set of challenges for our classroom teacher. And the kicker is we have 1 in 5 children will have some form of mental health illness. Even more profound amongst those children coming from harmful stress environments. And we have no children's mental health system. We are not equipping our teachers, our schools, or our society with what it takes to break that cycle of poverty. You just heard the opening of my stump speech I've been given for the last 7 or 8 months. It is core to our future, and it's central to why I'm running.
Well, yeah, you touched on a lot of the things we'll talk about today. So, yes.
Here's the slideshow for tonight. If you want to see it, that's all I just went over. We're covering around the state with a slideshow on Iowa's Future Forum and leading with those issues.
Well, we all here, we know that they are important. And so I think I'll start off with, so one of the major parts of what the next governor will do is set a new budget for the state. And so we'll start off with talking about budgeting for Iowa's priorities. And I'll have Charlie lead the discussion on this topic.
Thank you. And as you know, I think 10% of the federal budget is directed to children. At least 70% of Iowa's budget is directed toward children, and really the federal budget supports the decisions that are then made around state budgeting to augment our efforts. It's really directed to the health, safety, education, economic security, and development of Iowa children. Over the last 20 years, however, Iowa's experienced several budget crises and across-the-board cuts affecting children, and some of the cuts that have been made have yet to be restored, let alone enhanced. State budget growth overall has lagged the growth in the state's economy, and lawmakers have enacted and often phased in tax cuts have made it difficult to maintain, let alone enhance existing programs. So the real question to you is, what is your plan to tackle tax policy issues to ensure a stable and adequate state general fund to pay for Iowa's priorities, particularly children's health, safety, education, economic security, and development?
Well, certainly we can't continue the path they just did last week, which is going to make it more complicated. I've laid out a number of potential revenue sources that we obviously have to have revenue to address the issues we just talked about. One is to cap the business tax credits. I would change a number of them to deductions so that companies that aren't paying taxes here do not get a check from our taxpayers to subsidize their business. Those have now topped $300 million since just the commercial property tax cut in 2013 has topped $300 million. I've advocated for rolling that back. We have the business tax credits have now, I think exceeded $200 million. That's like the research credits and a number of the business tax credits. I also advocate for capping the manufacturing sales tax exemption, which was projected to be 25 million, is now over 80 million, and we capped that at 25. That we do a combined federal income tax on corporations, out-of-state corporations. 46 states tax corporate taxes, only 25 do a combined. We don't. That puts our state businesses at a disadvantage. We have out-of-state corporations that are shifting their income out of state and their expenses into state to capitalize on our non-combined federal corporate reporting. That's a revenue generator of over $100 million. That again, I can argue that helps Iowa businesses to not be a disadvantage. Regional and national banks franchise fee puts our Iowa banks at a disadvantage. I think we should increase the fees, levelize the fees on regional and national banks, and that's a revenue source of between $20 and $30 million. Raising the minimum wage lowers the earned income tax credit eligibility, so that's a savings there as well. I've also advocated for raising the earned income tax credit. I do have some concerns about some people who are capitalizing on that don't actually have low incomes and have large net wealth. We have to figure out how to get at that problem. So there's just a few examples. You'll see my slideshow tonight of where I'm advocating for sources of revenue to address these needed investments in education and mental health care.
Well, and then the other side to what we budget for would be then family economic security. So I'll have Lana talk about that.
Currently in Iowa, we have about 15% of our children living in poverty, and many more living right on the edge of poverty, if not below the poverty guidelines. And they're all struggling to make ends meet. And particularly for families when their children are very young, it's the hardest time for them to have enough economic resources to meet their needs. The growing inequality of income and wealth in America is developing disparity and opportunity for kids as well who come from lower income households. Persistent poverty is one of the strongest predictors of future health, education, and social well-being, and strong work support programs and policies focused on family economic security lower the rates of children living in poverty and enable families to meet both their caregiving and breadwinning roles. What actions will you take to reduce multi-generational poverty and ensure that all children have access to equal opportunities in order to succeed?
Well, certainly our education formula needs to take into account where we have underserved and lower income populations and make sure the resources there, those children get adequate education. We've got 3 elementary school districts in the center part of Des Moines that the classroom turns over 60% a year. Imagine you're a teacher and your class changes out 60% during the school year every year, which is a affordable housing problem in our inner city. And so we have to address affordable housing, so we stabilize these children to remain in the same house, same school throughout the year. As I mentioned, raising the earned income tax credit, increasing the child deductions above $40 a year, which is just crazy. I don't think they did that in this bill, did they?
No.
They did. I forgot to include the sales tax on internet that they did this year. That's also revenue generator. So I've advocated for increasing that earned income tax credit, child deduction. We have to raise the minimum wage. I've advocated for tagging it to the federal poverty level index at 130% of poverty for a family of 4, which is $15.37 an hour over 5 years. I'd like to do it sooner, but you know the realistic opportunity for doing that less than that timeline. None of that will happen if we don't have a Democratic legislature or a more progressive legislature. Funding pre-K through 12 at a level that enables it to meet those challenges I talked about. Eliminating the child care cliff is in my slideshow. You'd see tonight if you came as well, so that you don't lose all benefits at $11.17 an hour. We stair-step that down over time. I like to say, I have been saying across the state, for the $20 million we gave Apple, we could eliminate the child care cliff for the parents of 5,000 children. Put up to 5,000 more people into the workforce versus the 50 jobs we gained from that $20 million. So I'm doing some comparative out there so people see, wow, it's not just impacting and breaking the cycle of poverty, it's impacting our existing businesses who need workers and can't find them, who are here paying taxes. But we have a non-sustainable economic development strategy, which is to hand out tax breaks to out-of-state corporations. I've advocated doing like Colorado does to make sure that children who aren't going on to college are in a job skills and life skills training program by the junior year in high school, and before they graduate, they're earning a paycheck, so they can see a different path forward. But too many of them making life choices right now, they're making them less employable or unemployable. And that's another concern I hear from employers across the state, are too many of our applicants can't pass the drug test. It's related to poverty, related to lack of mental health services, and lack of job training skills that enable them to see a different path forward. So those are, I'm probably leaving some out, but those are issues I've been addressing and trying to raise amongst Iowans of how we break the cycle of poverty. I've also advocated that I have come out in support of IWIL, which I'm generally very opposed to regressive taxes, but I advocate for increasing it beyond 3/8 to at least 5/8 cent. So the additional quarter goes to tuition and income assistance for low-income families, for those children who want to go on to college, that we lower the burden for tuition for those families. In the short term, long term, we've got to bring tuition and funding support for regions and community colleges up so that those tuitions come down, given our current budget situation. I think our first focus has got to be on pre-K through 12 and early childhood and the child care tax cliff. Sorry, I love getting in the weeds, but I hope we're not too dry for you all.
Oh, good. No, well,
This is where we live in the weeds.
Yeah.
Well, and you just spoke a lot about early childhood and child care. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dara, and then Barb, if you'd like to contribute as well, to talk a little bit more about childcare and what that means to both children and our working parents.
So clearly you understand that working parents depend on accessible childcare in order to participate in the workforce and provide income for their families. I know you talked about pre-K 12 a lot. 80% of the brain develops by age 3, so waiting until pre-K is a little too late when we're looking at these vital early learning opportunities. So effective early care and education is like a 4-legged stool. It requires affordability, accessibility, high quality, and a supported workforce. 24% of Iowans live in a child care desert where there are too few or no providers in their area. The cost for center-based and family-based child care is out of reach for many families, and we have some of the lowest eligibility in the nation at 145% of the federal poverty level. Iowa's providers also struggle to make ends meet and attract professionals to the field with an average income of just over $20,000 a year and are not reimbursed at the current market rate for enrolling children with assistance benefits. So how will you support affordable childcare and access to programs, promote the importance of quality in those programs, and address the needs of the childcare workforce?
Well, a number of things. One is, and I'll start with the pre-K because then we'll go back to the younger years. Fully funding pre-K, which, I was over at the Bidwell Center a while back and talking to them about their challenges. And 10 hours a week is just, it helps supplement the child care, but the combination of the rate that we provide for the rate for child care assistance and the offset of the 10 hours in pre-K still make it difficult for families to get their children in full-time daycare, enabling the parents to be in the workforce. Eliminating the child care cliff, which I talked about, which is critical. That we stair-step that down over time, so it pays to stay in the workforce and adequately funds quality child care. This is revenue. This is a revenue issue. We've got to find the revenues to be able to support fully funding child care throughout this state. One proposal I've talked about for rural Iowa is capitalizing on our new revenue source from wind turbines. We've got about 35 counties in the state now, almost all rural, or they are all rural. There's a few in Blackhawk and maybe one in Turbine and Polk County, but 35 rural counties where you have a very difficult time finding adequate child care assistance. Those counties that have those wind farms will see over $2 billion in property tax revenue in the next 20 years. What I want to do is empower those counties to treat that wind farm revenue off budget. So they're not capped with the county spending levels, and they can have a Vision Iowa exercise in each one of those counties to how they can transform their counties with that additional source for revenue. For a county like O'Brien County, it's $100 million, $5 million a year for the next $20 million. And one of the things I've cited for them is to expand child care for their communities, because they have workforce needs and they have child care needs, and you're solving multiple issues with the investment in child care. And so, again, we've got to find funding sources. There's not a lack of awareness, I don't think, maybe you guys will tell me differently, I don't know there's a lack of awareness of the need for child care. There's a lack of funding. And which is going to be more difficult next year after these cuts. So looking for sources of funding. But yeah, I have met with a number of chamber of commerces and manufacturers and businesses across the state where that's one of the critical areas they point to. So how do we leverage resources, public resources? One is that wind tax turbine I just talked about, with local manufacturers and businesses to fund child care in our communities. I don't have a secret weapon here, except we've got to have the revenue sources and make it a priority.
Well, and a similar issue then to childcare as well would be availability of after school and summer learning opportunities, because as kids age, they don't. That doesn't mean that they lose that need for supervision. So I'll have Brittany talk a little bit about Iowa's need for after school.
Yeah, so as you know, John, before school, after school, and summer learning programs provide a crucial support for families by kind of filling in the gaps between work times and school times. providing additional learning opportunities for youth behind or beyond the classroom that are enriching, and also providing a place where kids can be safe. 75% of Iowa parents support public funding for after school, and yet the need for programs far exceeds the funding available. Among Iowa's K-12 students, about 140,000 are waiting for an available program, and 114,000 are alone and unsupervised after school. Iowa provides some support for after school and summer learning programs, but needs to do much more, particularly to meet their goal of literacy by 3rd grade. How would you ensure that all children and youth have access to high quality before school, after school, and summer learning programming?
I would double or triple the Iowa After School Alliance program.
Thank you.
I assume you all know our connection, right? Again, it's back to the same issue. How do we generate the revenues to make sure it's available? Certainly, the integration of STEM and after school has been an exciting project for us to work on, and find that incredibly valuable to augment those, especially those children that have fallen behind, and utilizing that after school care time to catch them up. So quality after school is particularly critical for those children who haven't made 3rd grade reading level. You know, it's 57% for students on free and reduced lunch. It's 90% for students who aren't on free and reduced lunch. Those are pretty obvious data indicators of where we have to focus our efforts to enable those, particularly those children coming from low-income families, to catch up. And I mean, I'm preaching the choir here, but it starts early, but it's a continued effort throughout the after-school care in which they're in school, to create a learning environment for this learning environment, and to capitalize on creating those learning environments with real content. So there's extra assistance for those children to catch up or maintain.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about health and well-being. So I'll have Mary Nell talk about that topic for us.
Sure. Well, you pretty much stole all the talking points and referenced them in your
That's
opening
why I tried
remarks.
to do it.
Yes. So you mentioned that almost half of all babies in Iowa are born eligible for Medicaid. And if you look at the Medicaid population as a whole, about half of all Medicaid members are kids. So we know Medicaid is a really critical source of health insurance coverage for children in Iowa, and allows them to access those well child visits, so their physical and mental well-being can be assessed, and identify any sort of conditions early on, and hopefully connect children to services as needed. You also referenced that 1 in 5 children suffer from a mental health condition in the state, but less than 2% of those actually access services, pointing to the lack of a children's mental health system here in our state. So our question for you, what actions will you take to ensure access to services to address the developmental, emotional, and mental health needs of infants, children, and young adults?
Well, certainly the privatization of Medicaid has been a critical factor in this, with nearly 70% of our mental health patients on Medicaid. We are driving healthcare providers from this state. So that's one of the most, in my mind, one of the most critical pieces, is to bring back in most or all of the Medicaid to a state administered. And use that to help address part of the shortfall in the children's mental health system, because many of those children are on Medicaid, and we've got to have reimbursement rates and a commitment to providers that make them want to stay in Iowa or practice in Iowa. I mean, it's twofold. One is the rates don't even cover their overhead. More importantly, I think most people who go into mental health services, particularly children's, go with the goal of making an impact on someone's lives. And we're not creating an environment in which they can feel like they can make an impact. And so the provider levels are critical. And particularly in rural Iowa, it's just nearly impossible to find mental health services for children. Partnering with our schools, providing as much in-school opportunities we can for evaluation, treatment. Utilization of telemedicine in rural areas, because we know we can do quality evaluations through telemed, which helps reduce some of that burden or some of the challenge for getting mental health providers into rural areas. I think those are all steps we can take, and the telemed piece is not even a high-cost piece. We're just not initiating enough action, and Medicaid commercial MCOs are reluctant to reimburse or cover any of this. So that's, you look at the organizational behavior of any organization, and you look at the behavior of the Medicaid system, there's just, Pulitzer Prize was one on it, right? With registered and exposing the failure of what they were doing. So if you want to understand the organizational behavior, you have to look at organizational structure. And the structure of our privatized Medicaid is inherently wrong and not going to succeed when the motivating factor for managing it is for profit, as opposed to healthcare. So we have to begin to bring back within a state administered system those most severe cases of mental health illness and disabilities first, because we have to stop the continual disruption of the care coordinators amongst the families who are under stress and can at least deal with the stress of the constant changing care coordinators. This has been traumatic, as you all know, for many, many families in the last 2 years in Iowa, this transition, and it's got to stop.
And something related to health and well-being would be safety, children being safe in their homes and their communities. And so I'm going to turn over to Abby to talk a little bit about safety and security in Iowa.
In 2015, almost 8,300 children were found by the state to be abused or neglected by caregivers, and nearly 6,000 children were placed in the foster care system. Iowa has rates above the national average in both abuse and neglect rates and out-of-home placement for children to be found to be victims of abuse. Child welfare services are intended to prevent or respond to abuse and neglect and provide safety, permanency, and provide for the well-being of children removed from the homes. Yet too many children enter and remain in the foster care system and don't have permanency in their lives. Each year, children age out of foster care with major barriers to success, and current investments place greater emphasis on placement than prevention. Additionally, 2 high-profile deaths of children who were adopted from the Iowa foster care system and the investigations that followed raised concerns about the capacity of our current system. So my question is, what actions would you take to reduce the number of children who are subject to abuse and neglect, and how would you ensure that youth aging out of the foster care system have a promising future?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the foster care system. I'll just be honest with you. Other than if I hadn't run for governor, my wife was really serious about trying to take a foster child in this year, so I kind of screwed that up for the family. And I'm not going to pledge today that as governor I would do that, but it's something we've talked about. I think raising the profile, the need for finding homes for folks, for kids, would be one thing as a non-cost. I'm trying to think of non-cost items, and not just, so much of this comes with funding, and the caseload for our DHS workers. I don't know how much this directly impacted the placement of foster children, but I'm just going to make the assumption that globally, that's included in many of the functions we expect DHS to be able to do, and it's nearly impossible for them to manage their caseload today. So I assume that impacts the ability to find homes and care for foster children. So again, you got the funding issue, but you also have, I think, raising the profile of the need to find. And I don't know the data on this. Is it difficult to find foster homes, and is that complicated by the payment system, or just on the willingness of finding enough people who want to take in foster children?
I can definitely say I'm not the expert in foster care. I know that there's a
Well, you make me
shortage
feel
of
better
foster
then.
care homes.
Huh?
I know that there's a shortage of
Yeah, I would assume.
homes for children who need foster care services.
That's gotta be the most
Yeah,
challenging.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the unique needs of a lot of the kids that are coming out of, or needing foster care too, and you mentioned, drug, I think you mentioned drug impacted babies, we have the opioid crisis too, and so you have this need for people who, can really be there 24 hours a day and take care of that child that's in care. So I'm a registered foster parent too. So one of the things when we decided to become registered was reading a newspaper article that said Webster County has the most infants and toddlers in need of care and, foster care. And so and I think they still do lead the counties in the need for foster care. for infants and toddlers.
So you don't have enough families, I mean, where do the children go? What's the system, what is the system for them?
Good question. I can tell you, we can get probably some days 7 or 8 calls. Can you take Johnny? We have a 2-year-old, and believe me, I think about what happened to Johnny, or can you take Sophia? She's 1 year old. We're interested, and they just go down the line. And I know some of them hang out in offices at the DHS building. Some of them do go to emergency care and short-term placement, so they move from one home to another because people can only take them. I can take them for a couple of days. I can take them for a couple of days until they find a more permanent placement.
I think one of the things, I know Sheila and her circumstances, she's not only a foster parent, but she's really a reunification partner with the home from which the child was taken and really working in that 2-generation approach. And I think that there are issues around how we finance our foster care system, but also how we really support and value and respect foster parents and provide them what they need. The work around reunification or context of how you can build that relationship. Often barriers are placed on families when they try to do that, rather than being supported in how they achieve those ends. One of the things I was really pleased when Governor Vilsack was governor of he knew the foster system, and he spoke to, I think in a real way, the needs of kids and their families, and the role that foster families can play, not only in providing that safe, secure environment, but also in supporting that child's ability to come to grips with and understand and heal from the placement and sometimes enable that reunification. And we have very few, historically, governors who've been child welfare governors. It's kind of something, it's not a great boon to be a child welfare governor because things can go wrong in the system. But I think that's one of the things that we really need is to have an attention given to the child welfare system, to the players in the system, as you mentioned, the workers, the foster families, and the birth families who have things going on in their lives that have caused the need for intervention, but who still need to have supports, and many can grow to be, they want to love their kids, but they need the supports that enable them to exercise that and provide that safe environment.
I think a lot of it can be resolved if we resolve some of the other issues you've spoken about. And Charlie's right. I mean, we have 330,000 people who walk through our 17 local community action agencies in Iowa. And I've yet to meet anyone who said, you know what, I really want to mess up my kid's life.
Right.
No, I've not heard one person say that. And yet things happen where they get desperate and they feel they have no choice but to do something that then jeopardizes the well-being of their child. Because they're in crisis and they're desperate and they do desperate things. So if there's something done on the front end before they get to that crisis situation, we're less likely to need as many foster homes. And I think Charlie's right, you know, in our family development program, we've been doing this for 30 years probably. Was it 89, Charlie, we passed?
Right, yeah.
1989, which was also the last year we increased the FIT payment. You might want to keep that in your back pocket. And, you know, some of the hardest situations in that self-sufficiency program are the ones where moms have lost their kids. And yet they continue to stay enrolled in the program so that they can change. They want to change. But they need support to be able to do that. And they're not getting it from DHS. I mean, we had a conversation with DH last week about doing a focus group, and they're like, well, we never see families. We never see families. Our emergency maintenance workers just do everything over the phone. And as the state institution that works with families in poverty, that really bothers me, that families can't even go to an office and talk to somebody for help, which then sends them to our agencies because we're the only nonprofits left out there in rural Iowa. And the churches can't meet the emergency needs because the churches are going away and they don't have the resources they used to have because families don't have the money to give to the church. So, you know, something on the front end that makes it easier for families to succeed is a key part of the success of foster care.
And DHS has a great program called Parents as Partners. A lot of times if you have a birth parent who's lost their child to the system, they're very angry. They don't want to talk to DHS. They don't even want to talk to the foster parents, and that relationship is hard. And so they have parents who have experienced losing their child to the system and then getting that child back. So they, you know, form their peers, and they know what they've been through, and they will talk to them and work with them through what they need to do to get their child back. And I think that's a promising
However,
program.
They don't pay them enough.
Right.
So they
That's the
can't
other
make a
thing, too.
living wage at doing this
Right.
fantastic
Because
service.
they are
so
paid,
there's a
yeah.
lot of attrition
Turnover.
from that program, as I understand it. Another issue for those same folks who you think would be excellent people to come into work at DHS in different capacities can't because they have this background of child abuse. They're not allowed to work in the child welfare system. So that is a real a punishment for them as well, and it impacts the you know, people with lived experience who might be able to work and be able to impact the system.
So I know that we're probably gonna be moving to another question, but I just wanted to also share that the child welfare, children of color disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. If you look at states, we're at the bottom of the way what's happening with our African American, Latino, Native American kids. As kids get older, they're more likely to stay in foster care, and there's very little support around families of color. The other thing, and this is just a note regarding the 2 deaths that we had, these 2 girls were adopted out of the foster care system, but they were also homeschooled. It's another issue. So, you know, thinking about the child welfare system and how it impacts families of color is really important.
Yeah.
You asked.
I asked for a
Yeah.
reason. It's just,
Yep.
it is equally important, just not as much in this discussion out there.
Yeah, I mean, but as Lana mentioned, like, it's what do we do on the front end, and I think all of these issues are connected, you know, and if we can get families to be economically secure to start off with, then we can mitigate many of these problems that we've talked about. So, and that's why we do the work that we do. But I guess, so we only have just one other set question for you, and it's on a similar topic, and so I'm going to have Denise talk about the very urgent issue we're facing here in Iowa of human trafficking.
Yeah, I think some people don't have any sense of the problem here in Iowa around human trafficking, because I think it's a horrible subject and they don't really want to think about the fact that that could be going on in their own backyard, and it is. 40% of the victims of reported human trafficking cases in Iowa do involve minors. factors that make children particularly vulnerable to trafficking include a history of abuse, patterns of running away, unstable home life, and involvement in the child welfare system. Perpetrators do target children because their age makes them more vulnerable, and could be easier to manipulate, and they could be recruited from schools, parks, and other public places, including foster care and group homes. Human trafficking can happen anywhere at any time. How will you address the issue of human trafficking and ensure the broad-based training needed to educate all Iowans that serve, teach, protect, respond, or utilize our natural resources?
Well, let me ask you, so creating public awareness, I presume, is necessary so we increase the spotting or identifying it. And so help me out here in which way I don't know the best indicators, the best procedures, but just do a open thinking here on a policy. But so I would presume increasing public awareness. And I've heard a little bit of human trafficking. It's only been raised with me 3 times on the campaign. And so I interpret that to mean there's not a great deal of public awareness about it. And then educating the public, creating awareness and educating the public on how to spot it.
Well, and I think part of the problem is that people don't think about the times, the spikes, and when that happens, I personally was quite appalled to learn that it spikes during state fair. But what was really appalling to me is spikes during drake relays. I don't know why I felt those were different, but I did. And then also we have to think about
would that be because you have people not living here, so coming in from out of town, behavior changes for some folks that can't do it in their local community? I don't know.
Possibly, and then I think the other thing I thought of as far as the state fair goes, and I'm not an expert on human trafficking clearly, but with state fair, just like domestic violence abuse calls go up, a lot of it's due to loosening of inhibitions due to alcohol consumption, I would assume. And that could apply as well for drink relays, I would imagine. And then we've got the geographical pattern that people don't necessarily think about. We've got 2 intersections of major interstates, and so it's easy to come in and out. We've got here in town, obviously I-35 and the I-80 corridor, and then on the western side of the state, we've got I-29 and I-80 corridor. So that makes it a little bit easier for the mobility of the traffickers.
So you got the public awareness piece, which is, so you engage in community policing, if you will, some kind of theoretically. So what's the law enforcement piece, and is there not sufficient resources, not sufficient law enforcement officials that are tasked with this or engaged in this? Or is it lack of cooperation between federal and state? Do you have any?
Well, what do we have on the patrol at night now in Iowa? What is it? The number of highway patrol vehicles out from 2 to 6 is like 5 or something, some unrealistic, safe number. So, I do think that's part of it. I think they're the ones that are going in and out of the rest stops and just having an awareness, making sure the staff who work in those facilities know what to look for. But I think increasing public safety and their in-depth understanding. I don't mean just a peripheral understanding, but I mean an in-depth understanding of signs of human trafficking is key.
And I think one of the best practices that actually, as I understand it, has come out of the state of Iowa, and so it could be applied to other populations, is working with the truck drivers. Because they are in places where this is occurring, and so if we can raise the awareness of them to be paying attention, then I would think that some of those same strategies could apply to the general population. They just aren't at the truck stops as often, but it was a good target. And there is a guy in the Attorney General's office who does training around human trafficking. One guy though, who is willing to go statewide. I would say that increasing that. We've got several different groups scattered across the state that are working with survivors. But I guess, that's awesome and absolutely needed, but again, getting in on that prevention, what is it that we can do to keep these kids who are suspect being recruited safe, so that they don't feel like they have to do that in order to escape whatever it is that they're trying to escape.
And so, we talked about adult education and general public awareness. What's in place now in the schools or?
Well, we've been
DHS?
trying to pass some legislation around with sex education training, or sex education and sex education training. Other resources that does training in schools with, so teachers could recognize it, or other nurses, other folks could maybe recognize signs, or I guess, I'm not the expert in it either, our expert isn't here. Some of the risk factors that they might see around human trafficking. And the other thing too, and I know there's been some legislation floated the last couple of years around increasing penalties for human trafficking, and I can't tell you a whole lot about that, but that has been a difficult one to get passed. Some reason, I don't know what that reason is, but.
Also, we need to educate the DHS intake workers. I heard one horror story, which is only one story, right? But usually if there's one, there's more, of where a DHS worker, they've got a call that a 16-year-old had been human trafficked by her own parent with a much older, I assume it was a man, I guess I shouldn't assume that. And the answer from DHS was, well, she was of age and consented. Consent. Well, fortunately, the law enforcement in that area picked up on it. And so I think, really getting everybody up to speed on what is truly human trafficking versus, oh, she's of the age of consent, so that was all right, is really.
Yeah, and human trafficking is an industry, and it's a shadow industry, but it's profitable. And it preys upon not the people from Taken or other movies, but it preys upon those who are not in the, kids who are already struggling.
Vulnerable populations, yeah.
Who lack those supports. And I think that there's been bipartisan support for doing something about human trafficking. But most of that has been reflected in, we're gonna enact tougher criminal penalties, which, in addition to that, you have to have more actual enforcement and education, as we talked about. But I also think one thing that's really been missing is a commitment of resources to those people who have become victims of trafficking, and to help them get their lives back together in supports. And I think it was mentioned that there are some support groups and people who go out there and do this work. But that hasn't been fronted, that hasn't been a major emphasis upon public policy. How do we create that healing capacity and response, as well as the preventive response? One of the things Iowa has, which I think is great, is it's made a commitment to foster youth and former foster youth in terms of supporting them through the Achieving Maximum Potential, through Youth and Shelter Services, and the Youth Policy Center actually combined to provide support for kids who are in foster care and have been in foster care, to connect up with each other in social support activities, and also in making recommendations to the system about what should exist for kids and families. They've been some of the most outspoken people around what we need in order to prevent and respond to human trafficking. And some of those kids have been human trafficked. And I think their credo is, don't make decisions about us without us.
Yeah.
And what Iowa has distinguished itself from most other states is providing support that goes beyond having a once-a-year gathering of a bunch of youth who could then make recommendations to the system, but to having 20 chapters around the state which meet on a monthly basis and connect with one another. One of the first things that happens when kids get into the foster care system is their lives and their connections with others are disrupted. From their neighbor, from someone who might be a mentor, from their cousin or uncle or aunt who might provide support.
That's interesting, Troy, because I assume there's some good in that and some bad in that. So if you're a care provider, foster care parent, how do you trained enough to know which ones of those relationships are important for the child to maintain, and which ones do you spot are important you try and sever? I would assume there's some balancing.
There's some, I guess, experience, like Sheila can speak to this too, but yeah, I think that there is, as far as foster families, kind of a feeling like there can be a kind of I've rescued them from this home and don't want anything to do with it. Most foster families, if they are saying, can we have a safe environment where we can meet the foster parents and understand what's going on and be supported in doing so, find that they do become those agents. Often that family does love a child, whether or not they can whether they can be a full partner and raise their child. That child also wants to know and have some closure on what happened with my family.
Sure.
Angela said it's hard to convince a child of his own worth if he's been told that he's not worthy to live in the only home he's ever known. And that's what the disruption and separation causes harm. It may be necessary. But the more you get and nurture and support the voice of those foster kids and have them recognized and have them be able to connect and speak their mind, the more you give. I mean, foster families often go to lengths of retaining these connections when they have to pay for it out of their own pocket because they got to drive the kid 15 miles to visit his foster parent. I mean, the whole system needs, in some ways, to be redirected toward what's in the best interest of the child is supposedly what the system is about. But then let's really talk and know about the child and the child's experiences and what the child is feeling. And that kids becoming systems kids where they don't have any outside group of people who they know can look after them, like my son had next door neighbor, a teacher, and a coach, in addition to us. When they're severed from that makes it lonely growing up and hard. And I think our systems have to be redirected there. And the same holds in terms of kids in preventing and responding to trafficking. We have to have more of those watchful eyes and mentors and supports. And we have to have our system that's geared toward that.
And I think just to add to that a little bit, I think as a foster parent, and I think just as a human being, your instinct is to protect. And so you think you're protecting them from what they were just taken from because somehow it was harmful, and so you want to protect them from that. But I think then, you get to realize that there is a relationship
Protecting
there.
that relationship is
They
important, too.
deserve to know and have that opportunity to figure out whether or not, if the ties are severed via the state or whatever, then, there's some things you have to follow. But, you try to keep that relationship going the best you can.
I think it's a framing too. I mean, I think sometimes if we frame it as, ideally, in the perfect world, parents would not, or children would not be separated from their parents. But in reality, we know they are. But if we can frame it in the process of how do we get these back, how do we get this family back together? So what do the parents need in order for the child to be safe and loved by their parents?
And one of the issues that puts kids at risk is the fact that they're moving from foster home to foster home to foster home.
Yeah.
And they don't have that continuity of care. They don't have that continuity of relationships, be it schools, neighbors,
It's like those
Sure.
kids moving those elementary schools. It's the
Right,
same thing. It's
exactly the
it's
same thing,
The
yeah.
disruption and
Right, and so that makes it
mental
really hard
development
for
that
them.
comes with that, the sense of, yeah.
Connection.
Yeah, so looking for that sense of connection, I think, is one of the risk factors for the kids who are in the foster care system.
Yeah. That sense of connection is, as we even see the non-poverty children losing that sense of connection.
Yeah.
Right.
You see
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
You see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dangerous time.
Well, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time and your time as well. I just want to see if there were any last questions that any of our members would like to bring up, or you, John, if you have any questions for us about any issues, since we do have many experts in the room. But to have the opportunity, yeah.
Actually, I just have a comment, and I know I mentioned a little bit about the disproportionality in child welfare, but if you look at all these issues, there is disproportionality in what happened with families of color and all these different issues. So I just wanted to bring it up and thinking about these issues, really thinking about how there's communities that, well, it doesn't, it won't float all boats, that whole saying. Like,
What?
you really have to be
What?
more intentional in the way you think about what Iowa families need.
I presume you're familiar with the One Economy study that we did at my business, the Blackpool County One Economy study.
I don't think, like, you have it.
I got one brochure left. But it was on the, and that was more specific to the African American and refugee community in Des Moines. But some very informative data there about poverty and additional barriers for success.
Is it on your website too?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That obviously, that's where I wasn't from that study, but that was a more recent conversation I had with this Isaiah about the elementary school turnover. But we've got to, I get so frustrated with Des Moines, I'm sure it's elsewhere besides Des Moines, but their idea of trying to make Des Moines a more diverse community is to recruit professionals from out of state to come here. And I'm like, we've got a diverse community already, why don't we invest in their success? And then maybe those other people, professionals, will come here because it's a inviting community for people of all diversities. So we're missing the boat on how we become a more successful, diverse state. And that's generally always through helping people up the economic ladder. And that's where we're failing today in too many areas in Des Moines, statewide, but Des Moines is a glaring example of, I consider, a powder keg if we don't address the disparities such are noted in that study.
Well, I just thank you everyone so much again for being here this morning. And John, to you, thank you for taking your time again to talk with us today. We look forward to our continuing conversation with you as we
I
move
look forward
towards
to
the
this
primary.
meeting in the governor's office.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And if there's anything we can ever do for you, let us know. We have many other organizations other than what's represented in the room that is part of the coalition, and we can connect you with anyone that you might want some information from or sort of advice. And then just my last request is if we could get a photo with you, and we'll get all of this information out from the meeting today to you and to all the members, so we can share that with voters as we get really close to the primary day now. So,
Well, thank you all for, first of all, what you do, and for the opportunity to share with you. If I am doing my best, as I said in this campaign, part of the responsibility, I think, in campaigning is to advance an agenda that you want to get the public behind when you get into power. And so I have been very focused on these issues for that very purpose. Having said that, you're the experts. I'm not the policy wonk on this. If you find something that helps me tell that story more effectively, or something I'm saying wrong, please, I want to get this right, and I want to get the public behind and recognizing how important this is. So I ask you to, you don't have to do it because you're endorsing me or supporting me, but just make me a better advocate for the causes that you're working on, because I'm gonna help advance that cause.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
we
you.
can do that. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Grab a picture.